Hi, so today's unit we are going to be discussing carbohydrates, and essentially what we want to cover when we look at carbohydrates, this will be a two-part lecture. So today we're going to kind of focus on the basics of carbohydrates, and then in the second part of this unit we will be discussing carbohydrates in more detail as it relates to exercise. So some of the major objectives of this particular unit, we want to understand what are the advantages of using carbohydrates as a fuel source, and then also what mechanisms by which carbohydrates are thought to aid performance. So again, those are kind of our two major goals: to understand, again, what are the advantages of using carbohydrates as a fuel, and also what are the mechanisms believed to allow us to aid performance when using carbohydrates. So, what are the advantages of using carbohydrates as our fuel source? First and foremost, carbohydrates are the only fuel that we can use anaerobically. So again, if we want to do anything with a high intensity, or at least, that moderately high intensity, carbohydrates have to be our option here. One thing I want to point out before we get too far, I noticed in this unit, is my abbreviation up here, CHO. You'll find CHO used as the abbreviation for carbohydrates as we move through this unit and throughout the rest of the class. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. So from a chemical standpoint, when we look at carbohydrates, the three components that they have include carbon, which is the C, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so that's why it's called CHO, is because it's made up of carbon, double the hydrogen, and then oxygen in an equivalent proportion of the carbon molecules. And again, I've got some images of the chemical setup or the chemical composition of carbohydrate molecules a little bit later in this slide. Okay, so if you see CHO, that's the abbreviation for carbohydrates. So anyway, we were mentioning that it's the only fuel that we can use anaerobically. It uses oxygen more efficiently than fat. Okay, and again, that's probably the primary reason why we're utilizing carbohydrates in an anaerobic setting, because we're better able to utilize oxygen when we use carbohydrates as that fuel. Okay, so when we think about oxygen at our maximal oxygen consumption, for example, we can get about 5.05 calories of carbohydrates per oxygen molecule. Okay, so for every oxygen molecule that I can bring in, I'm able to utilize 5.05 calories of carbohydrates. Okay. Now, when I look at my oxygen utilization associated with fat molecules, okay, we can get about 4.69 calories of fat per oxygen molecule. Okay, so essentially what we're saying is we're able to use oxygen more efficiently when we use carbohydrates. And so when we're doing maximal exercise, so we're kind of maxing out our oxygen consumption, we can also max out our energy utilization when we choose carbohydrates over fats. Okay. And then lastly, the other advantage of using carbohydrates as a fuel is it's a faster means of getting energy. As we talked about in our energy expenditure unit, carbohydrates are the fastest mechanism for us as it relates to those metabolic pathways. And if we were to utilize fats as a fuel source, it takes significantly longer for us to activate those pathways. Okay, so carbohydrates seem to be the best bet for us if we're interested in doing something fast, if we're interested in doing something at high intensity. So additionally, in addition to kind of some of those advantages that we mentioned as it relates to using carbohydrates as a fuel, carbohydrates are uniquely important for three different tasks. And again, these tasks can only be done with the use of carbohydrates as our fuel. Okay, so carbohydrates are uniquely important for red blood cells. They're uniquely important for the nervous system, and they are uniquely important for high intensity exercise. Okay, so again, when we say that they are unique, what we're saying is that only carbohydrates can be used as a fuel source for red blood cells, and only carbohydrates can be used as a fuel source within the nervous system. And again, as you already know, carbohydrates are our only option if we're interested in doing high intensity exercise. Okay, so again, in order for us to have red blood cells, which we need to have to maintain just general normal life, okay, and also the nervous system, again, those factors are 100% exclusively relying on carbohydrates as our fuel choice in order for them to be able to carry out their normal physiological function. Okay, so let's take a look at the different forms of carbohydrates. Okay, so we have glucose and glycogen. And glucose, as you might remember from our metabolism units, is our most simple sugar basically. Okay, so glucose is our most simple version of the sugar, and glycogen is made up of many sugar molecules linked together. Okay, so glycogen is our storage form, and glycogen is simply linking a bunch of sugar molecules or linking a bunch of those glucose molecules together and then allowing us to store those in various places. Our two most common places to store glycogen include intramuscularly, so inside the muscles, and then also within the liver as well. Okay. Glucose, again, will kind of be a free-floating molecule, a simple sugar that's ready to be utilized at any given time. And generally, this is about 8 to 10 grams. So we have about 8 to 10 grams of glucose floating in our blood at any given time. And kind of as a reference point, our brain, again, we said that the nervous system needed to rely on sugars in order to fuel that particular system. And the brain uses glucose at a rate of 4 to 6 grams per hour. Okay, so again, think about this and think about the dynamics of metabolism and how important it is for us to be constantly monitoring our blood glucose levels. Okay, we have 8 to 10 grams of glucose in the blood at any given time, and our brain is using 4 to 6 grams per hour. So again, when we think about the activity level and the monitoring of blood glucose, this is very important for us because it is constantly changing. Okay, as we mentioned with glycogen, two places for them to be stored. One is inside the muscles, and muscle glycogen, we have between 300 to 400 grams of glycogen stored. And again, if we keep in mind that 1 gram is equal to about 4 calories, this tells us we have between 1,200 to 1,600 calories of sugar stored within the muscles at any given time. Okay. Again, if I became a highly trained individual, especially an endurance athlete, I might have upwards of 500 grams of glycogen stored within the muscles. So again, with regular chronic training, we become better at being able to store more of this in those particular scenarios. Within the liver, we have about 75 to 100 grams of glycogen stored. Again, with training, this number isn't really modified because the liver has so many other processes to do. If we are going to see a modification in the amount of glycogen that we have stored, it will be within the liver. Okay. So again, we think about the total amount of sugars that we have stored within the body. It's approximately 1,800 to 2,000 calories worth of sugar in storage that we can utilize in a variety of settings. So let's take a look at the chemical composition. So again, as we mentioned, the chemical structure associated with the sugar molecule involves carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules. So here you can see our 3 different monosaccharides. We have glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, certainly I'm not going to test you on the chemical differences of these molecules, but I want you to appreciate how similar they actually look. They all have the same carbon backbone, essentially, and so the differences between these molecules basically has to do with how we organize the hydrogen and oxygen molecules around the carbon frame. Again, without getting into too much sciencey details, you can notice the difference in kind of how these H's and O's are organized. That's kind of the simple version of that. Okay, so again, let's kind of look at a little bit about the differences between these three. So glucose, again, as we said, is kind of our most basic unit of sugar, and again, we'll convert both fructose and galactose into glucose once we get them into the body. So again, glucose is our primary energy source for any human cells. Fructose comes from fruit. So again, it's known as a fruit sugar. So again, lots of fruits have fructose in them. Again, if you remember back to our metabolism unit, fructose will be absorbed through facilitated diffusion. So it's the slowest to be absorbed, which is good if we're interested in just general health, because it's going to give us a slow release of sugar as opposed to some of our more simple sugars that go through active transport, and that'll give us like that sugar rush feeling. Okay, so after fructose is absorbed, it'll be carried to the liver, and then it'll be converted into glucose, or if we consume a lot of it, it can be converted into fat as well. In addition to being found in fruits, we can also find it in processed items such as high fructose corn syrup and some of those kind of more, you know, processed types of sugars. Okay, galactose comes from milk or dairy products, and again, as is seen with fructose, once it is absorbed, it'll be carried to the liver where it can then be converted into either glucose or glycogen, or if we overconsume it, it could be converted into fat. So again, that's a little bit of a review of those monosaccharides, or those single molecule sugars that we have. Okay, di means two, so disaccharides are made up of two sugar molecules linked together. So here you can see the different disaccharides. So here you can see sucrose is made up of a glucose and a fructose molecule. Again, I'm using some of the biochemical abbreviations for these. So GLC is glucose, FRU is fructose. Okay, so here you can see that those two molecules, when they're linked together, create a sucrose molecule. These are found in like your white, brown, and powdered sugars. Also, honey syrup are some examples. Lactose will be found in milk products. Again, this is a disaccharide that links a galactose molecule with a glucose molecule. Okay. And then maltose is made up of two glucose molecules linked together. This is used in the fermentation process associated with alcohol. Otherwise, these are generally found in a longer chain of a polysaccharide. Okay, so again, we don't see a lot of maltose molecules just kind of floating around in the different foods that we consume. Generally speaking, it's part of a bigger chain. Okay, and our complex carbohydrates, or our polysaccharides, poly means many, so it's made up of many sugar molecules linked together. So here you can kind of see how these molecules are linked. There's three sugars linked together, but in reality it's more like this really big strand here. This is a true, polysaccharide. Okay. Long chain polysaccharides contain at least 10 simple sugars linked together. And so again, these can vary in length depending on the scenario and where in the body, or, what type of food we are consuming. Starches are found in plant products, and plants are going to store glucose in the form of starch. So a starch is basically a plant's version of glycogen. So again, we consume those starches in a variety of different plants as a way for us to get some of those carbohydrates. So again, when we think about, how does this apply to us? How does this apply to our athletes? Again, I want you to think about, first and foremost, when we think about helping our athletes, the first thing we want them to do is to be healthy. Okay, so in order for us to worry about sport performance, we first have to teach them and educate them on general health. Okay, if they're not healthy, then they're not ready to focus on some of those sport performance concepts. Okay, so we need to establish healthy habits kind of up front. So when we think about, what are our athletes consuming? What are these carbohydrates, or what are these sugars that are being consumed in the United States? I found this in some research that was done in 2017. And this looked at the top carbohydrates consumed in the typical U.S. diet. Okay, so again, I want you to think about, what are the foods that you consume, what are the types of sugar, or what are the items that you eat that contain carbohydrates, and see kind of how you compare to this list. Okay, so the top 5 carbohydrates consumed in the U.S. include number 1 is bread. Number 2, very surprisingly to me, is soda or pop of some sort. Number 3 is added sugars, such as in cookies, cakes, candies, those types of things. Number 4 is potatoes and pasta. And number 5 is cereal. And again, when we think about cereal, that can be good or bad depending on what cereal you're choosing, right? If you're choosing, Frosted Flakes versus, multi-grain Cheerios or something like that, we can think about the quality of carbohydrates that we might find in a particular cereal. Same thing with bread. If I choose white bread, not great, right? But if I'm choosing like a whole wheat, whole grain bread, that's a pretty healthy option for us. Okay. We think about number 2 with the soda. There's not really a healthy option for soda. If anything, we could talk about when we're thinking about calories in general, would it be better for us to consume diet soda? Right? So diet soda doesn't contain any calories. So from a caloric standpoint, yes, diet would be better. Would it be better to just avoid them both altogether? Yes, absolutely. But again, thinking about this from a caloric standpoint, the diet would be a better choice in that regard. Okay. So again, we've got to think about first and foremost, how can we promote health with our athletes before we're ready to dive into some of those kind of deeper issues as it relates to sport performance. So again, I want you to kind of reflect on yourself and on your own nutritional choices. And I think it is important to set a good example in this regard. When we think about, being a role model for our athletes, are we showing them the right things with our nutrition, right? Or are we, asking them to do something that we're not able to do, right? So again, I think when we think about setting an example of health for our athletes, that can be powerful, right? They're going to see what we're doing on a bus ride or on a bus ride home, or what snacks we are eating at that track meet or at that game, or that tournament, etc. Right? So again, think about what you're consuming, and what types of sugars are you consuming. And we talked about in our first unit, kind of this 80-20 mixture. So again, 80% of the time making healthy decisions, choosing the championship options, and then 20% of the time kind of letting yourself choose whatever it is that you want, whether that's, an unhealthy option or whatnot, right? So again, thinking about setting a good example for our athletes, I think is an important component of kind of establishing health within our athletes. So another concept it's often discussed when we talk about carbohydrates is fiber. And fiber is found in fruit skins, yogurt, seaweed, whole grains, beans, potatoes. Those are some examples. And again, when we think about fiber, it's not actually a carbohydrate, although a lot of people kind of put it in this category, which is why we're discussing it with our carbohydrate unit. From a chemical standpoint, it looks very similar to the chemical setup of what we saw as carbohydrates in the previous slides. Okay. Why is fiber good? We actually don't know a whole lot about fiber. We don't understand really what it's doing from a physiological standpoint. So when we think about why fiber is good, we do know that there are a lot of positive health benefits associated with consuming fiber regularly. Okay. Some of those benefits include, better weight management, for example. We also see improvement in colon health. So those are two examples of really positive benefits we see when fiber is consumed in the appropriate amounts. Okay, so again, as we mentioned, weight management, additionally, an increase in colon health. So again, we see a lower prevalence of colon cancer, for example, for individuals that are meeting our fiber needs. enhanced blood glucose control. So again, when we think about fiber, fiber is basically like an undigested or an unabsorbed carbohydrate molecule. That's kind of how we classify it. And so its effect as it relates to glucose involves that basically it slows down the digestive process. So it's going to enhance our blood glucose control because we get this kind of slower release of the sugars that were consumed at the same time as that fiber. Okay. It can also help us reduce cholesterol absorption. So sometimes the cholesterol gets kind of like trapped basically within the fiber itself. So instead of the cholesterol being absorbed, it can kind of pass through that digestive tract and then be eliminated through the colon. So how much fiber do we need? Fiber is one of the nutrients that we very, very often are under consuming. Okay, so the average US women's intake is 13 grams per day. The RDA, or the recommended daily allowance for women in the United States, is 25 grams. Okay, so our women in general are getting about half of what they need. Okay, so we are taking in about 13 grams, but what we need is 25. Okay, so we're not doing a very good job of consuming enough fiber in general. Okay, for our men, the average US intake is 17 grams. Our men are doing about the same as the women. Really, the RDA for our men is 38 grams. Okay, so again, looking at what we are consuming, men are consuming about 17 grams per day, and they need 38 grams per day. So when we look at some of these health related benefits, weight management again might be a big selling point for a lot of people, but we're just simply not meeting this guideline. Okay, so again, I would encourage you to just try for a week to kind of keep track of your fiber intake and see if you're able to hit these guidelines. When I work with individuals that are interested in weight loss, that's one of the kind of the first things that I always talk about is, how can we add things in as opposed to take things away? So if we just think about meeting these fiber guidelines, the way in which we're going to do that is we're going to add more fruits and vegetables. And by default, you're not going to have room to eat some of those maybe more calorically dense items. And so by default, you're probably going to consume less calories in comparison to what you would have in a normal day. So again, I would encourage you to just maybe try that for a week and see, write down what you're consuming and see how you're doing as it relates to some of these fiber guidelines. So again, 25 for our females and 38 grams for our males. So when we think about the fiber guidelines, again, I also want to kind of keep in mind what are the minimum carbohydrate needs for us. And so RDA, or the recommended daily allowance, asks us to consume a minimum of 130 grams of carbohydrates per day. Again, this is just simply the bare minimum. So again, this isn't setting us up for success from an athletic standpoint. This is just the bare minimum that we need in order to maintain normal physiological function. So if we don't get this much, we need to produce some glucose via gluconeogenesis. And this is a term I want to kind of point out to you. Gluco means sugar, neo means new, like neonatal unit is a new baby, and then genesis means to create. Okay, so to create new glucose or to create new sugar, that's what this word means if we break it up. Okay, again, this is not ideal because if we are producing new glucose, generally speaking, it's coming from amino acids, and so basically we have to break down muscle in order to produce more sugar. And again, that's not something that we ideally want to do. Okay, average intakes between 200 to 330 grams per day for males and 180 to 230 grams per day for our females. Generally speaking, between 45 to 65% of our total caloric intake should come from carbohydrates. And again, those values are significantly higher than this kind of bare minimum. So again, as long as we're not really super restricting of our calories, we should have no problem getting that kind of minimum 130 grams of carbohydrates into our day. Another thing that we want to think about when we start to try to apply the use of carbohydrates as it relates to exercise performance is a concept known as glycemic index. And glycemic index essentially tells us how quickly we can take the sugars that we put into our mouth and move those into our bloodstream and convert them into glucose. Okay. The reference food for this is one piece of white bread, and one piece of white bread has a GI or a glycemic index of 100. Okay. So again, when we think about in general, as it relates to general healthy eating, would it be better to consume foods that have a high GI or a low GI? So again, a high GI tells us that those sugars are getting into the blood very rapidly, and a low GI tells us that we're getting more of kind of a slow release of sugars into the bloodstream. Okay, so again, for general health, we'd be interested in foods with a low GI, which means that we're not going to kind of have that sugar spike. We're going to have just kind of the slower release of sugar, such as what we see in facilitated diffusion. So again, items that have more fructose, such as fruits, for example, will have a low GI value. Foods that are going to be high in GI or high on the glycemic index chart would include things like Skittles, for example, or Pop-Tarts, or, like those simple sugars that are already pre-processed. So again, a lot of those items can head into our bloodstream really easily. So what are some of the factors that determine what the GI level is for a particular food? It's not just the item, right? So it's not just, am I eating a piece of bread or not? We have to also look at many other things. Okay, so for example, the starch protein interaction or the starch fat interaction. So if I took that one piece of bread and I put peanut butter on it, for example, okay, or I have that bread as part of a sandwich with turkey and cheese or whatever, right? So now we have to understand the relationship between the carbohydrate and fat, and the carbohydrate and protein as well, right? And so consuming both proteins and fats would slow down the GI or decrease the GI level because it's going to slow down the digestive process. Okay. The amount of starch, absolutely. So again, something with a higher amount of starch will have a higher GI. The presence of fructose and lactose. Fructose is again going to probably lower our GI. It's going to cause us a slower release of those sugars. Sorry, excuse me. The degree of processing of that particular food. So again, imagine consuming like a raw apple versus like a cooked apple, maybe like a baked apple dessert of some sort. Okay. The cooked apple or the item that is cooked will have a higher GI. It's easier for us to digest and absorb that molecule in comparison to like the raw form. Okay, so food processing will raise the GI. Okay. Food form, including particle size due to processing. So again, having small bites of something, or, like pureed, like applesauce versus an actual apple will make a difference for us as well. Texture, viscosity is important, and then also how much fiber is in that particular item. So fiber will slow down or decrease the GI for a food item. What about GI and exercise? So again, as we kind of start to apply some of this information related to carbohydrates into the world of sport and exercise training, we want to think about, when is it best to eat certain types of foods, right? So prior to exercise, we want to keep the GI of our food items low. Okay, so again, think about just kind of your general health as a general rule of thumb. We want kind of this slower release of sugars. Okay. During exercise, we want to have a high GI. So, for example, if we needed to consume Gatorade or something along those lines during a game, during a practice, during a hard workout, ideally, that Gatorade has a high GI because we want to quickly get those sugars into the blood so that we can get back to focusing on completing that exercise task. And then post-exercise, we also want to have a high GI. If it's immediately post-exercise within that first 15 to 45 minutes after exercise, if we have a high GI, that's going to allow us to quickly replenish our glycogen storage with those particular sugars that you've just consumed. So it's important for us in those particular situations to keep the GI high. Okay. So what are some of our concerns associated with using GI as a method for, understanding what and when we should eat things? Well, it actually varies from person to person. So again, we think about the speed of digestion and absorption. This can actually vary based on many genetic factors. It also doesn't take into account the amount that you've consumed or glucose kinetics. And glucose kinetics basically means like how quickly am I able to get those sugars into the cell so that I can utilize them. So it basically has to do with the movement of glucose from the bloodstream into the cell so it can be used. Okay. So it doesn't really take into account that. It only indicates how rapidly the ingested food appears in the blood as glucose, but it doesn't tell us any information about what happens next, right? So again, the next part is debatably the most important part of the process, and that's getting the sugars from the bloodstream into the cell so that you can use it for energy. Okay, so again, that this value doesn't give us any of that particular information. Glycemic load might be a better option for us when we think about being able to track, what's going on with a particular type of food. And so not only with glycemic load, not only are we looking at how quickly we're getting it into the blood, we're also going to consider how much we intake. Okay, so it's basically the GI or the glycemic index divided by 100. So again, now we're essentially, or I'm sorry, the GI times the amount of grams that we're consuming divided by 100. So again, it keeps in mind now how much we've consumed in addition to how fast it might show up in our bloodstream. So again, glycemic load might be a better way for us to kind of keep in mind how much we're actually getting within the world of sport. And when we think about, applying this to a sport performance perspective. However, GI, we see that being used, with diabetics, for example. That's probably the only population that really uses that value. Because they're concerned with speed of food getting into the bloodstream. And maybe just that. They're less concerned with, fueling for performance. They're just concerned with monitoring the amount of sugar that's in the blood at any given time. So now we're going to kind of move forward and take a look at the use of carbohydrates as a way to aid us in exercise performance. And as you can see in this slide, I'm very excited and very passionate about carbohydrates. And almost all of our research leads us to this particular statement. Carbohydrates aid athletes' performance. Okay, let me say that again. Carbohydrates can aid athletes' performance in a variety of settings, a variety of type of athletes. And again, in this unit and in the next, we'll get into kind of the nitty-gritty details of, which athletes are going to benefit from which of these kind of methods associated with carbohydrate usage. Okay. So how much carbohydrates do we need, right? So what factors are going to impact our fuel utilization during exercise? First and foremost is intensity of the exercise. So the more intense an exercise bout is, the more calories we need, the more carbohydrates we are going to use, okay? So there's a linear relationship between exercise intensity and, the use of carbohydrates, okay? So increase intensity, increase use of carbohydrates. Exercise duration. So again, we know that short burst energy has to use carbohydrates as we continue on and, exercise greater than 45 to 60 minutes, particularly if it's a moderate or low intensity, we'll start to use more fats as a fuel. And also state of training. And the more highly trained someone is, the more likely they are to rely on fats as a fuel. And again, this makes sense. I want you to think about this is the example I always give my students, but think about, two bank accounts. You have one bank account, which is your carbohydrate bank account, and that has 2,000 calories in it, or $2,000. Okay. And imagine you have this other bank account that has $70,000 in it. Okay, that's your amount of calories in fat stored. Okay, so you've got 70,000 calories of fat stored. You've got 2,000 calories of carbs stored. So when we think about, which bank account do we want to draw money from? And again, my example to college age students is always your bank account has $2,000. Maybe your mom and dad, their bank account has $70,000. Okay, whose money would you rather spend? Well, you'd rather spend out of the 70,000 because there's more in that account, right? So it makes less of an impact. And the same is true within our bodies. Okay, so we would rather use fats. So once we become more highly trained, we become better at dipping into those fuel reserves as opposed to using the carbohydrates, which we have in a more limited quantity. Okay, so again, we think about state of training. Highly trained individuals are going to be better at using fats as a fuel source. So how exactly do carbohydrates aid in performance? Okay, so again, I've kind of subdivided these out into various types of performance. And so we'll start with endurance performance. We know that using carbohydrates will improve endurance performance. And here are the ways in which we've shown this to be true or supported in science. Okay, so carbohydrates increase the ability to maintain a given exercise intensity for a longer period of time. Okay, so basically what we do in these types of studies, maybe I have somebody on a treadmill or using a bike or something along those lines. Treadmill is the easiest because we can kind of set that standard amount of work and then we don't have to worry about it. Like they either keep up on the treadmill or they have to stop. And so basically what we would do in these studies is we would have our subjects run on the treadmill, for example, at a particular pace. And we would do that with carbohydrates, and then we do another session where they did the same trial without carbohydrates in their system. And essentially what we are seeing is when they are consuming carbohydrates, they're able to stay on that treadmill a little bit longer. Okay, so maybe, without carbohydrates, they could make it 42 minutes, and with carbohydrates, they could make it 49 minutes or something along those lines. Okay, so again, I just made up those numbers. Those are arbitrary, but again, you kind of understand how we've come to these conclusions based on the simple study design here. The other way in which we've seen carbohydrates improve our endurance performance is we're able to work at a higher intensity during the later stages of prolonged exercise. Okay, so again, maybe an example of this would be, I want to have my subjects do a 40-mile bike time trial. Okay, and they can self-select their pace, their speed, all of those variables. And we've seen that when athletes use carbohydrates appropriately, they're able to really push the pace at the end of that time trial. Okay, and again, both of these methods are huge benefits for us from an endurance standpoint. We can maintain our given intensity for a longer period of time, and we can also work harder during the later stages of exercise in comparison to an individual who wasn't supplementing appropriately with the use of carbohydrates. What about resistance exercise? So for resistance exercise, individuals tend to be able to complete more total repetitions and complete more sets of a particular resistance training bout. Okay, they can lift for a longer period of time when carbohydrates are supplemented. However, in order for this to be true and in order for us to really see a significant difference, these individuals need to do strength training for at least 60 minutes in order for carbohydrate supplementation to be beneficial. Okay, so again, if we've got athletes that are going to do a quick 30-minute workout in the weight room or 45-minute workout in the weight room, then they don't necessarily need carbohydrates in order to kind of complete that workout at their, their best ability. However, if they are going to be in the weight room for 70 minutes, 75 minutes, or whatever, then using carbohydrates appropriately can enhance their performance, meaning that those individuals will be able to do more reps and more sets at the end of that workout in comparison to somebody who didn't supplement with carbohydrates. So what's going on? Like, what's the mechanism associated with an improvement in performance? Okay, so number one is a possible decrease in muscle glycogen use. Okay, so again, if you remember back to earlier in this unit, we talked about glycogen being our storage form of sugars. Okay, so now I've got the storage form of sugars, and I also have sugars kind of floating around in my bloodstream. Okay. If I consume carbohydrates like immediately before exercise or during exercise, then I'm going to increase the amount of blood glucose that I have, or the amount of sugars that I have kind of floating in my blood. And as a result, I'm going to decrease the reliance that I have on those storage forms of glycogen. Okay. Number two, I may decrease the rate of liver glycogenolysis. Okay, so again, if I have more sugar in the bloodstream, then I don't need to rely on the liver to kind of break down sugars into those glucose molecules. Number three, we can have an increase in blood glucose levels in the later stages of exercise. And again, that availability of carbohydrates is going to allow us to maintain intensity, because we know if we want to do anything with high intensity, we have to have sugar in order to do so. Okay. And then number four, during intermittent exercise, carbohydrate ingestion is thought to help us with the resynthesis of muscle glycogen. Okay. So again, imagine I'm a basketball player, a soccer player, something along those lines, and that's intermittent exercise, right? I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to sprint and, work at a high intensity, and then there's a timeout. So now I get some time to kind of recharge, or, there's a couple fast breaks or whatever, and now somebody got fouled, and so they need to shoot a free throw. Okay, so again, we can understand how in those particular types of team sports, we're going really hard, and then we've kind of got some recovery, and then we go really hard again, and then we've got some recovery. Right, so during those intermittent exercises, we are able to kind of resynthesize our sugar storage levels more effectively if we've consumed carbohydrates immediately before the exercise bout, or maybe possibly even during the exercise bout. And then number five, carbohydrates serve as a primer for fat metabolism. So again, we talked about with the Krebs cycle, how carbohydrates are going to burn, fats will burn in a carbohydrate flame. And basically what that means, again, is that we have to have carbohydrates available in order to make that kind of recipe go. And fats can be kind of substituted in at any particular point. Okay. So again, that just supports the concept for us that consuming carbohydrates actually helps us to be better fat burners as well. So what type of carbohydrates should we intake, right? Well, as we mentioned, before exercise, during, and after, we want to pay attention to the GI or even the glycemic load in order for us to get a good understanding of, what we should consume when. So what types of carbohydrates should we intake has a lot to do with, what type of event we're participating in, and what are the demands of that particular event. Okay, so here's a couple examples. So fructose, when we consume fructose alone, it does not seem to improve performance. Again, it's going to have slower absorption rates. So consuming fructose alone as part of kind of our general health is great, because we are utilizing that facilitated diffusion mechanism for absorption, which is going to be a slow release of sugars, which is great for us if we're just interested in general health. Okay. However, during sport performance, this isn't a benefit to us because it takes too long. We need those sugars right away in order for us to improve our performance or provide sugars that would allow us to work at a high level. So if we consume sucrose, which is fructose and glucose together, the ingestion of sucrose actually leads to greater carbohydrate oxidation rates than either alone. Okay, so again, we think this has to do with some different mechanisms that we can kind of activate at the same time. So again, not 100% understood why fructose is better, but we have seen that when we consume the sucrose, if we consume the fructose and glucose together as a sucrose molecule, that actually enhances our oxidation rate. Okay. So we should consume carbohydrates with high oxidation rates that are easy to digest. These can be used immediately prior to and immediately following exercise. And in the next unit, we'll talk in very specific detail about exactly what you want to consume at what time points before exercise. But here are some examples of some kind of higher GI types of foods that are good to consume prior to exercise. So you've got white bread, white bagels, pretzels, applesauce, Nutri-Grain bar, crackers, pancakes, rice cakes, ramen. Again, this is not an all-inclusive list, but this is a nice list of things that can be easily digested. They're not high in acidic molecules. They're not high in fat or protein. They're just simple sugars that can be pretty quickly digested and absorbed. Okay. What about liquids versus solids as it relates to the consumption of carbohydrates? Okay. So again, which is better for us? So solids, solid carbohydrates. So again, your granola bar, your Nutri-Grain bar, your bread, your bagel, etc. Those items will improve our performance. Solids empty from the stomach more slowly, which can provide us with a slow release of carbohydrates. Okay. So again, when we think about, what are the benefits of consuming solids? Well, they're portable, so it's easy for us to kind of carry those. Again, imagine like an endurance sport or something along those lines where maybe I have to carry my own foods and things like that. So, solids would be good for us there. They taste good, they're palpable. So again, eating a granola bar is something that I would enjoy doing. So there's a benefit that way. Um, the negative with using solids is you have to chew them. I know that sounds weird, but as someone who participates in kind of these like ultra endurance types of events, like when you're breathing hard, it's also hard to chew at the same time. So that can be problematic for us if we're using carbohydrates in the solid form. In that regard, if we are breathing hard, it might be better to choose the liquid version. Okay. It's hypothesized that consuming solid carbohydrates, 30 to 60 minutes prior to exercise can enhance our performance. What's the difference between then solids and liquids? So the liquid carbohydrate does seem to be advantageous for us because you are also getting that hydration element as well. Liquids tend to empty from the stomach faster than solids, so they may be better suited for exercise. Again, we have to be a little bit concerned about getting some uncomfortable feelings if I'm consuming a lot of fluid. And again, that could certainly lead to some GI distress and that sort of thing. But in general, it seems as though the liquid version maybe sits better with more athletes in comparison to the solid version. At the end of the day, when we think about how to apply this sport nutrition for each individual athlete, it is really important for us to think about the individual and what works best for that particular individual. So again, a lot of times with these different types of strategies, it's all about trial and error. So trying something, seeing what works, and then figuring out what works and just staying with it. Stick with whatever does work for that particular person. Okay. Again, other factors to think about when we think about consuming liquid carbohydrates. Again, we have seen that both liquids and solids are equally effective at being able to raise our blood glucose during exercise, which again is our end goal, because that's going to allow us to sustain intensity for, the prolonged portions of the exercise bout, and also maybe increase intensity at the end of the exercise bout. Can also allow us to enhance performance when consumed during an event. So again, they're equal in these regards. They're also equal in promoting glycogen resynthesis in the recovery process. So immediately after the exercise bout is over, we need to resynthesize, or basically like rebuild glycogen to kind of replace what we used during that particular exercise bout. And then lastly, really when we think about the difference in regards to choosing liquids versus solids from a carbohydrate standpoint, it's really important for us to figure out what that athlete actually likes. And so use that information to help us kind of figure out what's best for that individual person. Some researchers, again, are going to recommend the liquid version of carbohydrates following exercise because it's easier to digest. They're not as filling, and they also help us from a hydration standpoint as well. Okay, so again, I would encourage you to really, work with each individual athlete and figure out what works for each individual person. That's kind of our best bet in terms of setting these athletes up for success.